Hi everybody, I'm Stuart from the Norfolk Honey Company and welcome back for more Getting Started in Beekeeping. So this series of videos is designed for the complete beginner, the novice beekeeper, or somebody who's considering keeping bees for the very first time. If you check out the list on the right hand side here, you can see that we've got all of the other videos in the series, and it's well worth taking a look at those. If you haven't subscribed, please do, and you'll get an update to show you when the next video has been released, and you'll be able to then go through the entire catalogue of videos that we have and check them out at your leisure. So this is part 9 of our Getting Started in Beekeeping series. We've been looking at the beekeeping year in the previous few sessions, and today we're going to look at the late autumn and winter period, and here we're talking about bees that are being prepared to go into winter, so we're ensuring that they've got sufficient food stores. We're going to look at how we treat the bees through the winter months. We're going to talk about protecting our bees through the winter against certain pests that we might encounter, and also take a look at the repair and renewal of equipment, and also finally touch on how you might pick up some bargains at this time of the year. So let's get cracking with today's session. So as with the previous couple of sessions that we've had, we looked at the calendar and how the colony strength gradually starts to increase through the spring and into the summer, building up to a maximum number of bees in the summer, and then gradually declining as we head into autumn. And that trend continues as we move from autumn into winter. We can see that the colony number has a dramatic reduction in numbers, so we go from that high of around 50 or 60,000 in the summer, and it gradually falls back all the way down to potentially single figure thousands, maybe 9, 10 to 12,000 bees, depending on the type of bees that you have. And also, as you can see, the brood numbers also diminishes, and that's part of the whole process and cycle of a honeybee colony building up through the spring and into the summer, and then gradually declining and preparing themselves and being ready for winter and then overwintering. And it's important to remember that honeybees don't hibernate. We know, and we've spoken about the other hymenopterans, so we've got wasps and hornets, bumblebees, those species, all of those don't maintain a colony through the winter. And so, broadly speaking, the honeybee is the only bee species that will retain honey and therefore maintain a colony throughout the winter. Now, they do something called clustering, and for the non-beekeepers out there, this is where the temperature drops into single figures in centigrade, and what happens is the honeybees cluster together in a tight ball. So if you imagine you have the frames of the honeybee hive, and then the honeybees cluster in a ball and keep themselves warm, and they do that by maintaining close contact and having air spaces in between their bodies, which warms up, and they can then insulate themselves and maintain that core temperature at the centre of the nest. And that's where the queen will reside through the winter. The core temperature is maintained so that they can rear some brood, but the brood numbers gradually dwindle down to almost single figures at the coldest, darkest point of the year. And as you can see from the graph, it drops dramatically down, and then we get this gradual increase back up through the end of January, February and into March, and back into the new season. So one of the important things for us as beekeepers is to ensure that our bees have sufficient food stores to see them through the winter. And if you remember back in the previous sessions, we were talking about the time at which we extract the honey. Now that changes dramatically depending on where you are in the world and the type of crops that you have for your bees to forage on. I think I mentioned that I remove the honey from our honeybees at the end of July, and I know that some of you have commented that you have heather honey which doesn't come in until later in the year, and that's fine. Everything that I say is going to be contradictory to some of you because you'll have different crops and different nectar sources for your bees to forage on. And so what I would say is take some local advice and find out when those times vary. But fundamentally, we need to make sure that our bees have sufficient food stores to get them into the winter. And you'll hear people talking about feeding honeybees, and we use a range of different products, predominantly sugar solutions in the form of a syrup. There are also candy blocks that can be made. There are fondant bars that you can buy to put on, and a whole range of different foods that you can give your bees in order to ensure that they make it through the winter. Personally, I like to make sure that I'm feeding sugar syrup to the bees around September time, so from the early part of September until the end of the month, to make sure that they've got sufficient food stores in the brood box to see them through the winter. And with the beehives that I have, which are predominantly commercial beehives, there's sufficient room in a single brood box for the bees to store enough sugar syrup and pollen to get them through the winter without the need for additional food through the winter months. That said, there are always some of my colonies that seem to eat more than others, and it's important that you check through the winter to make sure that they have sufficient food stores to get them through into the spring. And I've produced a couple of videos relating to feeding sugar syrup and hefting and getting the bees through the winter, and it would be worth just taking a look at those, more detail about how we get our bees through the winter by feeding them. So once we've ensured that the bees are well fed for the winter, we remove the feeders, and those get cleaned and put away. And the next thing to do is to look for other pests that might cause us problems through the winter. And for me here in the UK, there are really two that I have issues with at a couple of apiaries. One is the green woodpecker, and these are notorious for occasionally attacking beehives and putting holes through the side of the hive and feeding on the contents of your hive. And we use chicken wire wrapped around the outside of the hive to protect them from the woodpecker. And if you use a small enough mesh, then the woodpecker can't actually get through to then be able to get a perch on the side of the hive and punch a hole through into the hive structure itself. And the other smaller pest that we have sometimes had problems with is the mouse. And if the entrance is not protected or the entrance is too large, then occasionally you might find that a mouse will find its way into the hive and run around to a corner and make a small nest for the winter and gradually chew its way through the outside frames of your beehive, robbing the bees of important food stores and also making a fairly terrible mess inside the hive. So it's important that we guard against those, and we've produced a video to show you how we use the chicken wire and mouse guards on some of our colonies as well. And moving on from the winter protection of our honeybees, we also treat some of our beehives through the winter for the varroa mite, and we use a product called oxalic acid in the form of apibioxal, and this is trickled into the beehive when the bees are in a cluster, and we just gently trickle the syrup solution between the frames, and that then goes down into the hive and kills what's known as phoretic mites, and these are the mites that sit on the back of honeybees. The oxalic acid doesn't actually penetrate into the cells, so you need to pick a time of the year when there is the minimum amount of brood in your colony, so that the varroa mites have to therefore be on the backs or on the sides of either cells or honeybees, and as a result the oxalic acid treatment is very effective at killing those varroa mites. And the effect that has is that it dramatically reduces the number of varroa mite that you have in your hive at the start of the season. When the brood cycle increases and you get more and more brood developing in the hive, it means that you've got less varroa mites to take advantage of that increase in brood capacity. And we've produced another video this winter showing how we treat with oxalic acid, and that's well worth taking a look at. But of course, really, through the winter, there's not a great deal of work to do with the bees. We're not inspecting on a weekly basis. We don't inspect at all, really, in the true sense of an inspection. I might take the roof and the crown board off just to check to see that the bees have moved their position within a colony to where the food stores are, and we'll also use a method called hefting to gauge the weight of the beehive to see whether the food stores in the hive are being used or whether the hive is particularly light. And again, we have another video and we'll put a link up for that so that you can see how we heft a beehive. It's not a particularly difficult thing, and it does reassure you that the bees do have food. There is obviously, or not so obvious actually, there is an issue in that if the bees are in a particularly cold area and they've clustered tightly, if it's too cold, they might not be able to move the cluster to where the food stores are. And if all you do is heft the hive, you might find that it feels as though it's still quite heavy and has plenty of food stores, but the bees are actually stuck in one position, and so the weight of the beehive doesn't go down through the winter, it stays as a heavy hive. And that's something that you could maybe think about when you're hefting, and just think, well, actually it's mid-January, it's February, and the colony still feels quite heavy. Maybe I should just pop the top off and have a quick look. You shouldn't inspect the bees in as much as taking frames out of the hive, but you can actually see where the bees are clustered, and then you can use your hive tool to just pop it in and wiggle it near the bees to see that there are honey stores beside them. And that's worthwhile doing just to reassure yourself that they are on the food and that they're not going to starve. Having said that, it's a quiet time of year. If you have several beehives, then you might find that you've got an opportune moment to carry out some repairs or to renew some equipment. And it's important to try and get all of the equipment ready for the new season so that you're not playing catch up in April and May when you find that the bees are exploding out of the beehive and you need extra equipment, but you haven't cleaned the supers or you haven't made up those new pieces of equipment that you got for Christmas. And it's worth doing that through the winter while it's relatively quiet. And if you only have a few hives, then it's not a difficult job and you can get it done in fairly quick time. And finally, take advantage of any sales that some of the suppliers have at this time of the year. As you go through the winter months, you'll find that some of the major suppliers will have winter sales, and you'll be able to pick up some extra equipment, the bits and pieces that you might need for the new season, and they'll be at a discounted rate. And it's worth just making sure that you perhaps have a checklist of equipment that you're going to need through the season, and check out those sales and see if you can get yourself a bargain while they've still got the sales on. Okay, so that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed that. Next week we're going to be looking at swarming and the way that the honeybee colony reproduces by swarming. So please do hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and don't forget to leave comments and questions below. I will answer all of those, and if you have anything specific, then please go to our website and use the contact page and drop me a message, and then I can email you specifically about any issues that you've got. And don't forget to give us a thumbs up, and we'll catch up next time. Thanks for watching.